Hello, welcome to a short video where I'm going to run through the process for exercise 1, the introductory exercise for CAD 2 SolidWorks. So I've gone ahead and I've created a new part file, and I've saved that part file as plate 2 holes edge, and I saved that into its own subfolder. So I have a folder for all my exercises and then a subfolder for exercise 1, and I've saved the part file in there. Okay, so when you start a new blank part file, by default SolidWorks creates 3 planes, the front, top and right planes. The visibility of those is turned off by default, but you can manually turn those on. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to turn on the top plane here. You can rotate that around by holding in the middle mouse button or mouse wheel. You can zoom using the mouse wheel, and you can pan if you hold Control and press in the mouse wheel. You can move that around. If you want to look in perpendicular to that plane, for example, you can right click and go normal to, or you can hit spacebar to bring up the view orientation menu, and you can look in normal to whatever you have selected. In this case, the top. If I select the top plane, I should be able to look normal to that. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to create a sketch on that top plane. So I'll highlight the top plane here in the feature tree, go to the sketch tab, and I'm going to create a new sketch. And you'll see that by default SolidWorks will automatically reorient the view, so I'm looking in normal to the plane that the sketch is located on. So it's created a new sketch here called Sketch 1. Sketch 1 is located on the top plane. Okay, and Sketch 1 has its own coordinate system here with the origin at this point. So what I want to do is I want to create a rectangle. You have different ways of creating a rectangle. I'm going to use the first option here, a corner rectangle, so defining it with the first point and the last point. So I'm going to escape out of that. I'll do that again. If I select the corner rectangle tool, the first left click will define the start of the rectangle, and the second left click will define the opposite corner. So if I start the rectangle at the origin here, so if I left click on the origin, it'll create the first point. You'll see when I hover near to the origin, the little yellow icon that appears there is an automatic sketch relation that's going to be added if I click on that origin. So it means the first corner of the rectangle will be stuck to the origin, or it'll be coincident with the origin. If I hover my mouse a little bit further down, I could get SolidWorks to place it vertically underneath the origin or horizontally across from the origin. In this case, I want to start it directly on the origin, and it will place a sketch relation there for me. I'll place the opposite corner somewhere, it doesn't really matter where. I'll place it over there. You see this little green icon here, then that's that coincident relation that's been added in. And SolidWorks has also added in a few other relations to make these lines horizontal and to make these two lines vertical. Okay, I just hit escape there to cancel out of that rectangle tool. So this rectangle, I've just drawn it in roughly, it's not fully defined yet. One corner of the rectangle, as I said, is located coincident with the origin. The other corner of the rectangle is free to move around, so I can change the height and the width of the rectangle by dragging that. Or if I drag on one of the lines, I can change the width or the height. In order to fully define the size and shape of that rectangle, I need to put in some dimensions on that. So I could use the Smart Dimension tool, which you'll find in the Sketch tab on the ribbon up here. Or alternatively, you can use the shortcut for that, which is to hold down your right mouse button and drag up to get the Smart Dimension tool. So the Smart Dimension tool is context sensitive, I suppose you'd call it. If you click on a line, it'll allow you to put in the length of that line. If you then click on a second line, for example, it'll give you the distance between those two lines. Or if you, let's say, left click on that line and then left click on a line that's at some other angle to it, it'll give you the angle between those two lines. Okay, so in this case I just want to define the length of that top edge of the rectangle there as being 90 millimeters. Okay, you see when I put in that first dimension on my sketch here, it actually rescaled the size of the sketch. It made the whole thing bigger to make it 90 millimeters. I'll do something similar again. I'll left click on this line over here and left click once more to place the dimension, and then define that, or type in 40 millimeters for that, and you'll see it rescales the sketch again to suit. Okay, so that's the rectangle. Should be now fully defined, and if you look down at the bottom here, you'll see so far the sketch is fully defined. Next thing I want to do is draw in two circles on here. So again, I could get those circles from the sketch tab and the ribbon up here. A couple of different ways of defining a circle. I want to define it by the center and then some point on the circumference of it. So I can click that up here, or again, alternatively, I can use the shortcut wheel. So I right click and drag the mouse to the right, I get that same circle too. So I'm going to place in two circles roughly somewhere on my sketch. And again, use the Smart Dimension tool to define them fully. At the moment, they're underdefined. So each circle is free to move around. The location of the center of the circle is free to move. And also the size of the circle is free to move. So I'll use the Smart Dimension tool to fully define those. So if I right mouse button and up, I can click on the center of the circle to dimension the location of it, or click on the perimeter of the circle to define the diameter. So left click once on the perimeter of the circle, left click to place the dimension, and then type in your 10 millimeters dimension. Okay, I'll do the same for the other circle. Left click on the perimeter of the circle, left click again to place the dimension, and then type in your 10 millimeters. And you see the circle gets resized or rescaled to that dimension. Okay, so that has defined the size of the circle, but the locations of the circles are still underdefined. So I'll use the Smart Dimension tool again. I want to define the, in this case for this first exercise, I want to define the location of those holes relative to the edge of the rectangle. So I'll left click once on this line here, left click again a second time on the center of the circle, and what that does is it defines the perpendicular distance between the line and that point. Okay, and I want to define that to be 20 millimeters. Okay, so doing it that way, defining a distance between a line and a point, it'll give you the perpendicular distance. If, for example, if I chose a point down here, if I tried to define the distance between the corner of the rectangle and the center of the circle, it might give me the distance between those 2 points. Or if I move my mouse down here, it can give me the horizontal distance, or if I move the mouse over here, it'll give me the vertical distance. Okay, so sometimes you may want to define the straight line distance between those 2 points. You may want the vertical or the horizontal distance either. So it's probably easier in this case to just define the perpendicular distance between this bottom line and again, I've just hit escape there to cancel the selection that point was still selected. So I want to define, in this case, the perpendicular distance between the line and the center of the circle. Define that as 20. Okay, and you see now that that circle has changed. The color of it has changed from blue to black. That one is now fully defined. I can no longer move the location of that by dragging it. This one, on the other hand, is still underdefined. So Smart Dimension tool, right mouse button and up, and I can define the vertical distance. Here is 20. Okay, so that dimension there is driving the height of the center of the circle. I can no longer change the height by dragging it, but it's still free to move left and right. So I need another dimension on that. From the right hand side of the rectangle to the center of the circle, and we'll define that as 20 as well. Okay, now that should be all fully defined. All of the geometry in the sketch is fully defined in terms of both its position and its size. Okay, so that's that sketch done. Up here on the top right hand side of the sketch, I can hit this icon here to save the changes to that sketch. Okay, so sketch 1 here, if I rotate and just look at it, you'd see that sketch 1 is just it's a two-dimensional sketch that's sitting coincident with that top plane. Now I can right click on that here and rotate my view so that I'm looking normal to that sketch again. Okay, so that's a two-dimensional sketch. What I want to do now is create a three-dimensional feature or a three-dimensional solid body from that sketch. So I'll highlight sketch 1 over here in the feature tree, and then go to the features tab up here, and I can create an extrusion feature from that sketch. So click on extruded boss base up here, and what that does is it will extrude out the area bounded by that sketch, so the area between the rectangle and the circles here. That area will get extruded up perpendicular from that sketch plane. Okay, so for the purposes of this exercise, we'll just stick with the default parameters here. There are some things you can change. By default, it'll be extruded from the sketch plane, but sometimes, for example, you might want it to be extruded from a location offset from that sketch plane. In our case, we'll just leave that extruded from the sketch plane. You can set the direction that it extrudes. So by default, it's going to be going perpendicularly out in the positive Y direction. You may sometimes want it to extrude in the opposite direction. So these two little arrows here will flip that direction. There are some other options here as well. We might talk through those in a future exercise. And in our case here, we want to set the distance that it extrudes out. You can click and drag that arrow there, but we want to set that distance here to 5 millimeters of a thickness. And that is effectively it. We'll talk through some more of these options in a future exercise instead. So whenever you're done with setting your parameters here, you can click OK up here, or you can click OK on the top right here either. And what that does is it extrudes out a solid body based on the sketch that we created earlier. So that has created this new feature here called Boss Extrude 1. You can see it in the feature tree. And you can expand out this part of the tree here. And you see that Boss Extrude 1 has been created from sketch 1. Now, at any stage, if you want to go back and edit either one of these, you can. If you want to go back and edit the sketch, you can highlight it here and go to Edit Sketch, or right click and go to Edit Sketch. If you want to change the parameters of the extrusion, that extrusion feature, you can right click on that and go to Edit Feature, or just left click on it and you can click on Edit Feature here. So that will bring you back into this tool here where you can maybe change the thickness or change the other parameters. Okay. So that concludes this short video on the exercise 1, or the first part of exercise 1. I'll post another video on the further parts, part B and part C. So a couple of different ways of going about creating this part. Okay, thanks.